Okay, just a quick check with the judges. Are both of you ready? Should we start the debate?
Yep. Can everybody see the stopwatch?
Okay, just a quick check with the judges. Both of you.
Great.
Thank you. Should we wait for the live stream to begin, or can we start?
The live stream is up and it should be up and ready now. So whenever you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Chair recognizes first speaker of the proposition whenever they're ready.
Okay. Does everybody hear me? Okay. Dear panel, first I'm going to start with describing the status quo. Then I'm going to give you an illustration of the situation. Then I will present my first argument based on the change for democracy and our second argument that is a moral one. And my partner will bring you the third argument about opposition's resources, and we will explain why you should let the motion pass. First point, our status quo. Firstly, we don't think about Western liberal democracies like Germany, Canada, or France. We think about less developed countries with hybrid regimes, which means in between, not a complete dictatorship, but not a complete Western democracy. Here, we think it's not an open dictatorship, but there is a corrupt government, control of media, and courts are not independent. Thirdly, how we think these elections are run in the past. They're rigged. How? By 5 points. Firstly, we have dead people voting, examples such in Serbia. We have falsified ballots. We have coercion and blackmail. We have brainwashing from the media. Going to the elderly or easier to convince by giving them some false hope. And fifthly, we have voters' oppression. And how is this possible? This is possible with a corrupt court system. Fourthly, we have how the opposition is run. It is one big opposition party bloc. We don't have enough media space, and they are demonized by the media that is mainstream and government run. They have a clear goal, and they do have a potential to win the elections if they were to be fair. So, secondly, I'm going to give you an illustration of these boycotts. I think the most effective way to get a boycott is a total disregard for the elections and calling people for civil disobedience. For example, blocking highways, blocking courts, not paying bills, going on strikes. But in no way will the opposition incite for violence or ask the people to do violence of any kind. Let's move on to our first argument, which is making a change for democracy. We have 3 lines of analysis later. First line of analysis, inside the country, media will at least have to report about the election or the lack of opposition that is present. If they don't want to give the opposition much media space, they will have to say what happened at the election and that the opposition wasn't present because the people were boycotting. So this gives also non-mainstream medias more attention as people who want to get more information on to why the election wasn't run properly. People will feel disenfranchised because there are no representatives in the parliament because the opposition didn't go out to the elections. 3 things could happen. They can talk more and see a need to change, which they didn't think about earlier. They can get mad because it's not democratic. And you'll see just how much corruption really exists in these governments. Why? Because in these societies, a normal election rate of people going out is between 50 and 60%. So when we don't have an opposition, the 2 scenarios are likely. Either it will remain 50 or 60%, which means the government is blatantly lying and people will notice that for sure, or the percentage will drop under 40, which is a mockery of the election and the democratic system, and will blatantly point out that democrats are not present in that country. For our second line of analysis, we have the non-voters who in the status quo either don't care or don't think change is likely and therefore probably won't go out to normal elections. Now they will have second thoughts and are likely to engage because they see that something they can do might make a change. If they go out to the street, they might make a change in the long run for the next election. So they are more likely to participate in the politics and try to engage with them. Our third line of analysis is about the foreign community. The foreign community now has to bring attention to these lights. It's a media frenzy when something happens like this, a civil disobedience. And the foreign governments will have an incentive to do something about it and tell the governments in these countries, for example, in Serbia, they will have an incentive to tell the Serbia, hey, you need to do something, because the EU for sure does not want a circus in Serbia, and for sure doesn't want civil disobedience, because it reflects bad on them. As Serbia is one of the members who is likely to join at some point, they don't want to have protests and civil disobedience in that country. So they are likely to act and tell the government something needs to be changed. So that is another positive move for democracy. Does anybody have a POI quickly? Yes.
How is the opposition party going to be able to encourage people to engage civil disobedience when it has no formal channels like media interviews or election rallies that are allowed by the government to rally its opposition?
Okay, so opposition parties are here and they exist. So they have their own platforms, how they reach people. If they cannot reach people, they wouldn't exist. So they do find some ways in non-mainstream medias, in some posters, in some public speeches. Literally, you can be at the town square and do a speech, and you will reach to some people who will go home and tell their families and tell their friends. So even if the mainstream media doesn't give them attention, they still have possibilities to find another way, because people want the opposition. People who are convinced that the government is corrupt, they need to find a different way. They are hopelessly trying to support some opposition in order to change the current state. Now I will move on to our to our second argument, which is a moral one. So why is democracy important? We think that our underlying presumption is that with the lottery of birth, everybody is born equal and everybody should have an equal place in society. And we think you only have a freedom of choice that is, you have the most freedom of choice in our position because you have a chance of getting a fair election. When elections are not fair, your freedom of choice is non-existent, as whatever you do and whatever you circle, it won't be something that is possible to happen. So with democracy, if everybody votes fairly, we have the best chance of the majority of people to be happy, because everybody is born equally and should have the same possibilities to be happy. Our first line of analysis is that the opposition party has a duty to protect democracy. One, because democracy is the only way to have most people happy, and two, because they are the only ones that can help because of the corruption of the government in charge. There is no other way but a political party to gain support on a bigger level than for an opposition to be present. Our second line of analysis is why is it more democratic than to boycott than to vote in these elections? Because these elections are a mockery of democratics. Why? Because democratic is not only about voting, it is a political engagement and having a possibility to make a change in society. So if you participate in these elections, which are rigged and which you have absolutely no say in, you perpetrate the non-democratic way. In our world, we can fight for democracy and we can fight for free elections. So let this motion pass, because we bring the best way to democracy and we show you that the opposition party has a moral obligation to lead to a better life. Thank you.
Thank you, Proposition 1 speaker. I just need 1 minute and I'll be back. Roberto, if you could use a stopwatch that sort of comes up, maybe if you can just use the Google stopwatch, I think that would be great.
Usually that also benefits prompt teams. So there is also a competitive disadvantage. That's a problem that comes from someone. So we need to address this. Okay, this isn't delaying susceptible. No está pasando porque alguien simplemente ve así, nunca dije eso, pero eso no significa que puede ser aceptable que make these minor details a big deal. The second roll call is just to confirm the judges stayed there, because if after an hour, it's very possible people that disconnect everything. Now it's just to confirm that they're still there. Let's go that word. This is what I was trying to, I say every day, tenemos una hora de esto que empieza a volver todos los coaches. Like, I feel like that's always been correct. Judges, when it's irrelevant for them, we can speed things up. And have the motion start the practice and then start doing that. Start doing these things. So we can do and draw y por hacer los cambios draw. Eso significa que we delay the motion a few minutes, we create a whole and delay everything even further.
Sorry about the delay. Are the other judges ready? Chair recognizes first speaker of the opposition.
You can hear me? Great. People know when their leaders are cheating them and stealing their votes. When Evo Morales stuffed the ballot boxes on the second day of his presidential election, everyone can tell. And that undemocratic action sent millions and millions of people to the streets in defense of their ideal of democracy, and Morales was quickly removed. Running from the ballot box leaves democracy in the dust. I'm going to discuss three things in this speech. First, I'm going to discuss national accountability. Second, political support. And then my second speaker, Max, is going to discuss the long-term devolution of democracy. But first, I'll do some rebuttal to what we hear out of side government. I'm going to respond to their second argument first, their principled argument. And we tend to agree that democracy is quite important in this debate, but the phrasing of their argument is such that they only fulfill their principled obligation if they do actually get better outcomes in the future for democratic elections. Hence, if we disprove the practical aspect of their case, that is to say, the part that implies in the real world, then we also support their principle on our side of the house as well. So they say that groups don't have enough media attention. We disagree with this for two reasons. First, just because it's not true on face that only domestic media exists. There's a whole large plethora of foreign media that operates in different countries you can have access to in different countries. But secondly, Turkey, even though it is quite undemocratic, does not have complete control over the media. As they pointed out in the very second part of their argument, there exist small niche news services that our side of the house political opposition can use as well. So it seems like that's quite symmetric. Then they say that it's easy to point out when voter turnout goes down. Sure, but it's also easy to point out when you vote with the amount of people that could sway an election, you simply don't get the results. That is to say, when the ballot boxes are stuffed, when public opinion doesn't match up to political opinion, we'd suggest that that probably also receives an amount of backlash. So it seems symmetric as well on that point. On our side of the house, we can additionally get people trying to change that. I'm going to explain that later in our case. But furthermore, we can get terrible coverage on our side of the house as well, or they can get terrible coverage on their side of the house as well. So it's unclear why the voting incentives actually change on their side. A lot of the other stuff that I'm going to respond to is going to be integrated through my arguments. First, I'd just like to characterize what oppositions look like in this debate. So in many cases, side governments is a world where the perceived harms that they say exist for governments, that is to say, losing leverage, losing political accountability, losing political existence, are in fact magnified because the absence of genuine opposition, governments are going to try to build up fake and feckless oppositions to maintain their legitimacy. This looks like how in Russia, Alexei Navalny's general and genuine opposition exists, but there are also fake oppositions administered by the Kremlin and Putin that attempt to undermine the legitimacy of that undemocratic
area. This suggests that they're probably just going to drop out in the future, even if they get votes. They're probably going to support government policies, even if they get them. And those fake oppositions are going to exist on either side of the house. The difference then is that on our side, we have real political oppositions that operate as well in those elections. So you have a frame of reference as to what an actual opposition and an actual figure ought to look like. That's why Alexei Navalny does enjoy large support in Russia, despite the existence of these fake oppositions. The implication of this is that all of the harms of potential legitimizing elections exist on their side as well with these fake oppositions. You just don't get any of the benefits of actually supporting the public will and getting a check on the government. So first, on political accountability, we agree that we are not debating in the worst dictatorships or the best democracies. We're debating in places like Turkey, like Russia, like Bolivia, where there is wide control of the state. However, it does not enjoy complete control to completely stuff ballot boxes because it's extremely difficult to fully and completely rig elections. Because elections are often administered on a state or regional level, which means that if there's an opposition region that supports the opposition, they won't agree to the government's ballot stuffing initiatives. This is why northern Bolivia, despite Evo Morales trying to stuff the ballot boxes, got away with voting for the opposition leader because they genuinely supported that opposition party. This looks like how in major cities like Ankara in Turkey and Budapest in Hungary, they went to the opposition despite being, no thank you, really valuable for the government, and thus that actually embarrassed the government to a different degree. When leaders lose those key regions, they change their policy to save face and look malleable. So after they lost Ankara, Erdogan raised taxes as a strategic concession to the opposition. So on our side of the house, even if you don't get wide-scale democratic support, even the small amount of people who get in and embarrass the government are incentive to change marginally. But additionally, nationally, this looks like being able to be a check on government forces. Because many policies that are the worst for democracy, things like constitutional amendments to stack the court in your favor or to delegitimize the state legislatures, require things like supermajorities, where the vast, vast majority of politicians in the legislature have to support that sort of action. On our side of the house, we can get even small blocks of opposition leaders within those parliaments, and we can block those massively damaging bills for democracy. It means the courts remain relatively good, means that democracy does not remain stacked on our side of the house. So we can get that form of check, which is incredibly integral to democracy operating in the future. But additionally, not only do they not contest those regions that are in support of opposition already, they in fact entrench government power within those regions. When not contesting, oppressive party politicians often take over these regions just because there's no alternative. So even if you support the opposition in an area, you are still governed by the ruling party. And this means that the ruling party can try and take control of that region through political patronage. So this looks like in South Africa, how they granted power plants in regions that were against the ANC, or in Bolivia, how they decreased regional taxes on areas that were against the government. This means that in the future, those regions that would have supported the opposition on our side of the house are turned to the government side because of that political patronage. They get long-term harms. This means that on our side of the house, it's much harder to stuff ballots into the future when there is a legitimate opposition on our side. Finally, even if we don't get any change, we at least get people going to the ballot box and seeing the corruption for themselves. It's international observers that are able to call out discrepancies. It's official reviews that mean that when people go, they're likely to understand exactly what the opposition are facing. It means that people in the middle are no longer skeptical of the problem. Even if we get small support from the opposition, we get key political concessions and a key check on the government. I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so when you say that we can maybe sway the vote so they don't have the majority, the huge majority, the two-thirds majority in the parliament, how do you think that if we agreed on state suppression and if we agreed that the opposition isn't so big, do you think that in these cases you can make a third of the parliament be in the opposition? If as the motion says, the elections are completely unfair.
I understand. So I want to point out that even when elections can be rigged, as I pointed out, that doesn't mean they can be rigged entirely. Given from the start of your first speech, we agree what sort of countries we're debating in. Places like Turkey, places like Hungary, like Russia, these are places that have some degree of opposition power and thus can act as that check. Secondly, on opposition support and how they lose it. There are two chances that could happen in this debate. The first is where the opposition can actually act relatively legitimately. So this is because opposition leadership is going to be allowed some form of legitimacy or some form of freedom because the ruling party wants to maintain at least some degree of legitimacy in the election. So they want it to look as though there's a legitimate election going on, even if there isn't actually. This means that opposition groups are able to formally organize in rallies. They can distribute materials, leaflets, hold town hall meetings. They even have their name on the ballot for consideration, which means in the future, other citizens might vote after they do research on that party. This means on our side of the house, we can get that sort of change into the future. However, on Gov's side, when you don't even participate in the process, it's a lot easier to crack down on the dissidents within that party when they don't enjoy the political support that you might have and the legitimacy that you might have as a part of an election. They no longer are dependent, the ruling parties at least, are no longer dependent on these groups for the legitimacy and freedom of their election, unless they can crack down upon them. They can make people disappear in the night, jail dissidents, and cripple movements. The second opportunity is where there is in fact a crackdown on these parties. This leads to massive backlash and coverage from international actors, because it's not just people abstaining from voting, it's people actively being prevented from voting. People being beaten up on their way to the ballot boxes. These are things that got Robert Mugabe removed in Zimbabwe when the international community cracked down, when people realized that there was something shady going on there. On our side of the house, we get massive support for opposition movements, as well as the ability to be a check on political parties. We're very proud of those.
Can I start? Is it okay for me to begin?
Both the other judges ready?
Yeah.
Sure. For your proposition, the speaker number 2.
I would like to challenge a few things they said in a part of my rebuttal, and then I will head on to our third argument. First thing they said that I want to make clear: they're talking about countries when they are talking about how elections cannot be completely rigged. We gave you 5 reasons why this happens. We gave you dead people voting. We gave you falsified ballots. We gave you coercion, blackmail, voters oppression. We gave you brainwashing of people. This happens. Elections are completely rigged, and in these countries, the government doesn't even try to hide it because they know and nothing can be done about it. They are open about the fact that they are coercing people to vote for them. They are open about the thing that this is completely rigged. Second of all, I would like to talk about how it's not better for them to have a 1/3 when we are talking about elections who are completely rigged. When we are talking about a system that doesn't work because it's not free and it's not fair, even if they have a third in the parliament or any other way, it doesn't mean anything to them because they cannot do the things they want to do because it's not fair, because it's not free for them to even try to implement things that they would work for them, because the government is going to come and just ruin everything they want to do because these countries don't have they just can't implement everything they want to do. Second of all, I would like to talk to you about the fake oppositions. Why it doesn't make any sense and why it's not important. Even if it were true, even if governments would made the fake oppositions just so it can look like a democracy, it doesn't make any sense because people are going to see that the real opposition still exists, that it still stands, that they still are encouraging people to go to the streets, to actually do something about it. They will still have the real opposition saying, do not go to vote, and they will still have the opposition that talks to them what they need to do and what is happening by their media, by their platforms, by everything else that they will just use to just make this known. So the opposition still exists. So the fake opposition is just going to be known as something that is fake. Second, the third part of my rebuttal, which I want to explain to you, particularly why this is not hurting democracy and why it is efficient. First of all, democracy in this country already does not exist. By our characterizations that our first speaker gave to you, and by the motion itself that says that these countries don't have a free and fair democracy. So we agree that, so what we want to say is this is the only way that we can actually make a change. Democracy is not there either way. It just doesn't, what we need to do is bring enough attention to this. And how will we do this? We have people in other countries, when we just have people voting and we going to elections, what other countries and people see is we have an opposition who is not getting enough votes, who is not winning because it doesn't have enough support. And government and people are trying to paint this opposition as just being bitter about not having enough votes. And that is the reason why they're saying that democracy doesn't work and that something is wrong in this country. So when we have actually a opposition who is ready to sacrifice their chance to actually winning this election by completely boycotting this and by saying this is so corrupted that we don't even want to try to actually win, by doing this and by making riots, by bringing people to the streets, they're actually bringing awareness. This is a really big thing when you have an opposition who is saying we would like to sacrifice even the slightest chance to actually win, even though it's not possible in these countries. And we would like to do that by completely boycotting the votes. This is something that actually brings the awareness. You can have a POI.
In which circumstance is it easier to crack down on the opposition? The circumstance under which they are engaging in a formal election process, or when they are rallying people out in the streets who can be kidnapped and oppressed by the state, if the governments are as bad as Bob says.
The point, like I explained to you, when they do come out and vote, nothing is going to change. They will go year after year after year and still have like 20%, 5%, however much percent. Those percentages are not real because everything is rigged. So people don't actually see how much support they actually have. When you finally have two sides, when you finally have people voting for the government and people not voting if they don't like the government, you actually see how many people do not support the actual system. Even if they don't completely support the opposition, what it stands, the most important thing is to show that they do not want the government to stand and that it needs to be brought down because it's making democracy because democracy doesn't exist. So I want to go over to a third argument. It's about resources. So let's talk about resources for a second. Any party and any opposition party has their own resources. What their resources are. First, it is money given to them by their supporters. Their supporters give money to their opposition to actually represent them and to actually make a change. And so they have the funds. They have people who support them and people who are a part of opposition, and they have energy. Those are their resources. So what do they do with those resources now? They pay for campaigns. They pay for posters. They pay for just telling people vote for us. Even though that this makes no change, like we explained to you, they're just spending all of their money, all of their energy, all of these people energy to just do a thing that doesn't make any sense and they will not make a change whatsoever. What they need to do right now is actually use this money and use their funds to invest in like boycotting, to just try to make riots, to try to bring people to the streets, to actually do something about it. Two reasons why they need to do it. First, they owe this to the people who are voting for them. People are giving them money, so they will make actually somewhat of a change. When they are not doing anything in their power to actually make a change, and when they're doing every year just spending money campaigns, even though they know that that will not make any difference. They are not. This is not moral. They have to give to their supporters what they want from them. Second of all, this will actually increase the support for the opposition, because people will actually see that it's trying everything it can. It's actually doing something else. It's just trying their best to actually make a change. And the impact this brings, first of all, they will have themselves. So the opposition has the most by having funds going in this way. They actually have the most. They are doing this most efficiently. They are increasing their support, and of course, they will try their best to actually give their supporters what they want. So I want to give you a little bit of a conclusion. There is always going to be non-free and non-fair elections in some countries. This is something that is always going to exist. We need to do something about this. There is not a perfect solution. These countries are corrupted. These countries have a majority. I have something that is looked upon as a majority, and we need to do something about this. We agree this is not the only way, and this might not be the perfect way, but this is the only way where we can try our best and we can maximize the benefits we can reap. Because when we actually, by doing what? By actually bringing awareness, by actually getting help from people outside the country and also getting help from people inside the country, actually bringing awareness why this is so important. And second of all, by using our resources and funds to actually doing something that might help when the status quo is just doing the same thing over and over again, even though it doesn't implement any change. And even if this doesn't work, even the opposition doesn't win and doesn't do anything, this is okay, because we have the moral obligation to do this. We have a moral obligation to our supporters, we have the moral obligation to the complete society to just do everything in power to just keep democracy. So thank you.
Is it all good for me to get started?
Just give me 1 minute, please. Thank you. I'm ready.
Can everyone hear? Great. Team Serbia says that this debate takes place in the most oppressive countries, where governments are so unafraid of opposition that they rig ballots and they don't even care if anyone finds out. And that was why it was so inefficient for their solution and so ineffective for their solution to be dependent on entirely toppling those oppressive states. Because if this debate takes place in circumstances where they have brainwashed the population, to quote their first speaker, we do not understand why boycotting the government is likely to function. What is more likely is that their civil disobedience and protest will be shut down. That absent the actual mechanisms of the election, where they are forced to give opposition parties a platform, they will be gunned down in the streets, kidnapped, or worse, locked out of political processes entirely. We recognize, though, that the world does not take place in the extreme world of side proposition, that kidnappings, murder, and brainwashing are reserved for their fantasy debate, because this round takes place in the real world, in countries like Russia or Turkey, where opposition is allowed to exist to a degree, but at the same time, there are significant restrictions on their ability. So I want to point out the implications of a couple of things in this debate before I get into two questions. First, on which side is the strength of the opposition higher? And second, where can we hold the government to account best, even if we do not win or have any significant structural influence? First, on the implication of the fact that some fake opposition parties will still exist. The responsive proposition is that, well, when you boycott, you can tell voters that the opposition is fake, or you can call it out in some kind of meaningful way. But that ignores the examples and substantive illustrations that we gave. In Russia, voters are completely unaware that Vladimir Putin pays off a significant amount of his opposition to run pop stars and businessmen to attract 15% of the vote. Sure, you can boycott the election and tell voters that the fake opposition is not real and that you're the real opposition. But when you are denied any legitimate platform, you're not even running in the election. It is highly unlikely that you will have the platform or the belief to actually get away with that, particularly given that the government can call you out for being foreign influence and not even willing to contest the election. So when you have no platform, you can't just explain away that opposition, particularly because there is a limited amount of space for the opposition in media, and that space is likely to go to the more powerful government-funded opposition that is there to obfuscate the real truth. All of this meant, and the implication of this, is that on either side of the House, the government and the election are likely to seem legitimate in the eyes of the vast majority of voters, or at least enough voters in order to keep the oppressive government in power. All of that meant is that the boycott was going to cause the opposition to be out of sight and out of mind. We were able to prove that running from the ballot box leaves democracy in the dust. First question, on the strength of the opposition. A couple of things come from this. The big idea is that if we can encourage civil disobedience, this is likely to lead to significant benefits, or at the very least, the foreign community will be upset and some things will happen. This is the most substantive matter that we get from proposition, because even their third argument is just a reason as to why doing this approach works. All their third argument says is that the status quo is failing and add additional substantiation. So if we can take down the idea that boycott and civil disobedience change the incentives of the government or voters, then proposition has no claims left standing. So what do they say on this? The first is that voter turnout is likely to drop. I will note that given that governments can manipulate information on both sides, the government can still manipulate the voter turnout to make it seem like more voters came. But the more likely explanation of this is that it doesn't matter, because even if voter turnout drops somewhat, this is unlikely to change the minds of voters who are already wavering as to whether or not the government is legitimate, because those voters likely already know that there is a degree of illegitimacy and that there's already ballot stuffing. So it's very unclear why low voter turnout is going to matter for most voters who do not have the level of information that Prop implies they do. They say that the foreign community will be upset, but again, this information already exists. As Matt pointed out in first, there are already foreign election observers that come in whenever there's suspicion of a free and fair election. And I want to note the timeline here. We are talking about a circumstance likely under which the last election that happened in the country was unfair, and thus the opposition party in this debate is choosing what to do in the next election. Given that the opposition has suspicions that the next election is likely to be free or unfair, given that the previous one also was, that means that foreign election observers are likely to be present for the next election, and those are going to act as a significant check on the ability for ballot stuffing to happen, or at least make it significantly harder. The implication of this is that the next election that occurs, so the one that we're talking about in this debate, is going to be comparatively much more free and fair than the previous one that occurred, and there will be more chance of the opposition winning. The final idea was that you can see corruption. As Matt pointed out, this was a completely symmetrical argument. You can see the corruption of ballot stuffing on our side when you know that your friends and family support the opposition, but the government still wins with 90% of the vote. So obviously you can see corruption on either side, but on our side, you uniquely have a larger platform with which to see that corruption. I think Matt already pointed out that it was completely hung on their practical. But the second bit of it is that, well, you can have a moral obligation to boycott given that the whole system is broken. The system becomes more broken when you completely undermine and delete democracy off the map, as I'll prove in my third argument. On government accountability, the only substantive refutation they give to this is that you won't get 2/3 or 1/3 of parliament, and therefore you will not be able to meaningfully hold the government to account. A couple of things that this ignored. One, in a moment, Matt's argument on political patronage was able to prove that even if you get some people in power, that at least prevents those districts from being flipped by the government when it gives them free handouts like tax cuts, etc., and results in the government becoming more powerful. They say that people will see that the real opposition exists, but note, their civil disobedience requires the government to care about the civil disobedience, or it requires a toppling of the state entirely. Instability is more likely to lead to things like general unrest, economic harm that is not good for the opposition either, given that you can blame the unrest in the country on the opposition, which will undermine their ability to come in. The last bit of weighing I want to do before the POI is this. Given that their civil disobedience will be isolated to members of the opposition and everyone else will be too afraid to engage in it, their side permanently locks out the opposition from politics unless those elections become free and fair into the long run. And when they stay out of politics, they slowly become less and less relevant. because you cannot sustain enough anger to have political boycotts, civil disobedience over 4 years. So as long as the opposition is able to, the government is able to delay the election and maintain its power throughout, the anger that comes from their boycotts and civil disobedience, even if we believe that it works, will not last long enough to create change. I'll take the point.
Okay, so in status quo, where opposition party goes to the election, has very little mainstream media space. In our world, they attract mainstream media, international media, and all other outlets because of the riots and because of the boycott.
Sure, they attract mainstream media coverage, but as Prof notes, that media is owned by the government. We'll characterize them as rioters and chaos sowers who have no interest in engaging in democracy. So while they may get slightly more coverage in the mainstream, won't be coverage that's useful and will set back the opposition. Third claim on why this deletes democracy into the long run. I'll note that if we can prove this claim, opposition is out of the round because all they do is prove short-term benefits to democracy, while we prove it gets dismantled. Most of the places that we're talking about in this debate are circumstances where a strong norm of democracy does not exist. These are post-colonial states like Namibia and Kenya, for instance, where democracy has only recently been instituted. What that means is that when the formal democratic process becomes less relevant, so there are not as many options on the ballot, in some cases no candidates run and the government wins by default, and where the ruling party can justify deleting democracy entirely as a whole because the opposition won't even participate. What this means is a couple of things. First of all, governments are much more easily able to do things like delaying election by saying that the opposition won't even participate, and voters become less accustomed to the process of engaging in debates, political groups, and actually going out to vote. What that means is that it becomes significantly easier to actually just dismantle the Supreme Court and democracy into the long run when you can say that the opposition is not even engaging in it as a whole. Ultimately, for Prop to win, they had to prove that civil disobedience would work in states that they characterize to be extremely oppressive and unwilling to bend to the public will. We give the opposition a chance, and we're proud to oppose.
If the other judges are ready, I'd like to call upon the Speaker of the proposition.
Can you hear me well, or am I too quiet? Okay. We can start. So, firstly, I would like to point out that it would seem like the opposition is in a way trying to mitigate our case mostly to saying, okay, so they want either violence or a complete lack of electoral participation, and that is not what we are saying. The main thing, as we both agreed, both the opposition and the proposition, is that democracy is really important. Now, firstly, in my speech, I will focus on that part, on rebutting what they are saying, on contextualizing stuff, and then just showing how our world makes much more impacts compared to the opposition's world. Firstly, when we say democracy is important, we have things coming from the opposition that says, yes, running from voting is undemocratic. And to that we say that democracy is not only going to the ballot box. Democracy is much more than that. And democracy will kind of, democracy makes you do protests, it makes you do civil discourse, it makes you do public debates. Democracy is much more than just going out and voting and saying what you mean in the ballot box. The second thing that they say that we rebut is that this will not be effective. And we've stated before how and why this is what it is. Now, firstly, there has been one thing that came in the second speech from the opposition, and it says that if we've seen that the last elections were undemocratic, then we will see how, then there will be some foreign actors to monitor the elections. And to that we say, yeah, and who cares? Basically, the government has no obligation to say, okay, yes, we're so wrong, because in both worlds, and I think that everybody in this debate agreed to that, the government doesn't really care much about what people who don't agree with them think. They're likely to just either ignore or maybe just like, let's say Hungary did. They're just gonna say, okay, we didn't make 40%. Who cares? That doesn't matter. Like, people want it still, and they're just gonna continue with their reign. Why? Because they don't really care about the opposition, and that is where the contradictions in the opposition's case come. I will take a POI a little later. The biggest thing about the opposition's case is that they are really, really contradictory. First, they say that this you can't really do what we are saying if what we are claiming is that the media is censored and everybody is controlled. Now, firstly, they say that they will have alternative media sources. And to that, we say that those sources can't really reach anyone who isn't already voting for the opposition or who is thinking of it, because they are too small. And secondly, we say that if we have 10,000 people who are going to be reached by those things, it's better to put that energy of those 10,000 people to go out and protest than to go out and vote. Because 10,000 votes have a lot less impact than having 10,000 people standing in the street and saying that they are undermined. You can have the POI really quick.
If foreign election observers did not matter, then why would the presence of foreign election observers after a rigged election in Kenya in 2006 have led to the opposition winning the next election in 2013?
We both have examples where it doesn't matter or it does matter. I'm saying that it's not comparative. Like, you can't solve everything with foreign observers. And one more thing that is also really contradictory. The opposition says that we will have at least like a saving grace if we go out voting. They say that if you go out and you can at least get a third of the parliament and stop some really big laws and stuff, like something that will make the country even more undemocratic. But then they go on to say, yeah, but there will be a lot of false opposition. And that is really unsensible to think, because if you have false opposition, that's the equivalent of having just the government party. It's really illogical to think that it will gain anything, because, as you've said, there are countries and examples like in Russia or even here in Serbia where fake opposition just takes a part of that third that is an opposition, and then the real opposition can't really do anything because the fake opposition is instructed to cooperate with the government. I'm sorry, I had a brain fart. Now, the third thing is that, as we've stated, that at least some fixation on democracy will occur, that we will fix something. And I think that really goes down to mischaracterization of our case, because the opposition just says, okay, look, they want to just forget elections and tell people to go out. They won't have anything to. They won't have any bodies except people who are in the opposition. They'll lock out the people in between who are undecided, and then after that they say, well, then yeah, you should just go out and vote. And it's again a contradictory thing, because if you don't have enough people together to do something as an activist, then you don't have enough people together at the ballot box. It's really simple. If you can't reach people, none of these cases work. And what we are saying is that you will reach more people when you are doing the things we are saying you're doing. You will get a POI later. It's mostly about, as we've said, our main plan is to attract attention through something that isn't voting. Why? Because we have limited resources, we have limited manpower, we have limited political capital, and we have limited money. And we think that those resources will go a lot better to doing stuff like civil disobedience, like protests, like anti-government educations, more than they will go to just making a good campaign to get into the parliament so you can stop some awful laws. I will take a POI again.
Why will it be the case that a now delegitimized opposition will find it equally easy to get people to go and vote rather than potentially risk their lives and be oppressed by the government in the case of civil disobedience or protest?
Okay, so if you are getting like civil disobedience, it isn't really something that the government can stop the government can stop violently, because it's not violent, as we've said. Like, government should, in theory, only react with violence if violence is present. If protesters are rioting and looting, then they go and beat them up, they go and arrest them and stuff. If the protesters are just standing in the streets, they shouldn't. And even if if the protesters are, as we've said, called to be peaceful and just state their this dissatisfaction in a peaceful manner, and the government goes on to the streets and beats them up and throws tear gas, it even goes even more in our favor, because then the opposition is much more legitimized, and the opposition can go out and say, look, we're just standing in the streets and the government is going down and beating us down because they are afraid of what we can do. So that just puts even more legitimacy to the opposition instead of delegitimizing them as you claim. Now, since I only have 1 more minute, I will summarize the impacts. The biggest impact here is that we will practice democracy. The opposition has the wrong assumption, which they never actually really explained, and that democracy is the most important thing in democracy is voting. What we are saying is that voting is completely irrelevant, as if the motion says we know that voting isn't legitimate. So we have to find an alternative, and we as the government believe that the opposition has an obligation to make some sort of democracy if they are wanting a democracy. And that goes with civil disobedience, with protest. The second thing is that the opposition will at least use their resources, and after fulfilling their moral obligation, actually make some sort of a change, at least in small steps, better than going out and voting and having to compete with fake opposition and then doing nothing in the parliament, because as we both agree, the government doesn't like you. Thank you for your time.
If the judges are ready, Chair recognizes the Speaker of the Opposition.
Hear me all right? I want to make 2 strategic observations at the top of this speech. Firstly, when it was convenient for them, proposition said that democracy was already dead, that governments will do whatever they want to prevent the opposition movement from rising. On the other hand, they say there are active channels for discourse through the media, and that the government will look awful and be held accountable when these boycotts and protests happen. By contrast, we were clear. These are somewhat dysfunctional democracies with some degree of control over the media by the government, but the electoral mechanism is the best way to navigate that dysfunctionality and gain political power. These are places like Turkey and Russia, where there is large-scale unfairness, but still a capacity, for example, to win local elections. The second observation I want to make is that there is no avenue for change on the proposition side, because their frame is that elections will always be unfair. So it was unclear how they got any mechanism for accountability on their side. And that is where we got the shift in third proposition, that it is protests and civil disobedience that are going to mobilize the government to change. The first thing we pointed out is that protests get shut down, the fire that ignites them dies over time, and people don't want to take time off work in order to stay on the streets. It is a weak mechanism to hold the government accountable and an unstrategic one in the long run. But second, if they wanted protests and thought they were incredibly effective, I was unclear why we couldn't get those protests on our side of the house as well. The only difference is now they are not dissociated from the electoral mechanism, but complementary to it. They encourage people to go out and vote. They protest the unfairness in elections when it happens and encourage people to go out to vote anyway to shoot their shot. So at the end of this debate, proposition might have given some mitigatory lines about why we might not receive that much power on our side. But it was unclear how they can get any bit on theirs, meaning that they had no case to stand on by the end of the round. I'm going to talk about 2 themes in this speech. 1, do we get short-term power in politics? And second, political narratives and amassing support in the long run. Firstly, do we get short-term power in politics? This was the most important theme in the round for a couple of reasons. Number 1, because this was the clearest avenue for change. Opposition might have supported protests, but never actually explained how they're going to make meaningful differences in the ability of that government to be held to account. But secondly, because if we proved short-term power, that you would win some elections, we co-opt all their long-term benefits of increasing support for the movement. Because it is when people feel that they are politically powerful and not politically powerless that they're more likely to join that movement, to rally behind it, and to support its cause. So if we prove that we get more power in the short term, we win this debate right away. What were the claims we got from their side? The implicit push coming down the prop bench is that you won't win power anyway, and it'll always be impossible to do well in these elections. The first thing we pointed out is that there are a variety of mitigating factors here. The fact that international observers double count the votes and ensure that there's no ballot stuffing, for example. And that is why we know about election rigging in Russia, and it serves as a natural deterrent to the worst forms of electoral rigging on their side. That's especially true, as we told you, when these observers show up because the last election was rigged. Their response in third is the government won't care about opposition. The point is it cannot stuff the boxes when there are observers watching and who will out it on the international stage. No, thank you. If they themselves feared the fact that international backlash will harm the legitimacy of the government, presumably it's also the case that when you have international observers there, literally seeing you stuff the ballot boxes, that is a natural deterrent and check against that government abuse. But the second thing we said is, obviously there is some degree of unfairness, but still a degree and a potential to get some seats in parliament. The fact that opposition parties won local elections in Turkey and humiliated the ruling party, where that pushed Erdogan to change immediately. And it was unclear, even if we didn't get mass scale change, why that individual change on the ground within these local areas didn't matter. The third broad response I have to their argument is that there's an information problem here, which is when multiple local elections are run at once, federal governments cannot necessarily crack down on all of them. The problem is when an opposition movement orchestrates a mass scale boycott, they lose some critical cities that they plausibly could have won, because the unfairness doesn't seep into every single local election that occurs, and there are some that can indeed be won. Those places are critical. It means, for example, that you can win local elections and stop the entrenchment of patronage networks within them. Even if we cannot win a 2/3 majority, for example, no thank you, we can still win some cities. We can still present a credible threat to the government, such that it is forced to make concessions in the future, and such that it cannot fundamentally entrench all the patronage networks that Matt talks about in first speech that never went responded to. So by the end of this thing, we conclude the following. We are going to get more political power on our side of the house, some seats that are won, and some influence in government. And that was the most important theme in the round. Before I go on, I'll take the POI.
So let's rewind it back a bit. You said that we know that the elections are fake in Russia because we have foreign observers. And we can see that it's not really a matter of having foreign observers because Putin stayed in power, even though it's globally obvious that the elections are fake.
Yeah,
I mean, not really comparable if you want to do it.
Yeah, I got it. That is true to some extent, but it is also true that now political legitimacy of the Kremlin and Putin in Russia is crippling, and he's increasingly likely to fear its population and make more concessions. Obviously, this is not going to work everywhere, as you conceded as well, but we think it is at least better when you get some kind of power on our side and an ability to out those abuses when they happen. On to the second theme on political narratives and amassing support in the long run. The first thing from proposition is that people will now see something that they can do and push for political mobilization and change. The first problem we pointed out that never got a response was that the support you rally around a boycott and protest dies over time. You ignite the fire about unfair elections, but then that dies out in the interim between elections, as people have no clear cause to fight for when that injustice does not persist in the 4 years between elections. People have no incentive to join their movement on their side anymore when there's no clear pathway to political or electoral change, which means for the average individual deciding whether or not to join a movement, deciding whether or not to go out to protest, they get all the harms of having to take time off work, of losing the ability to care for their family and their children, and none of the benefits, which means that the movement probably shrinks over time when there's no clear avenue for change. No, thank you. The second thing we said, though, is that the narrative of boycotts is weak when because it is difficult to preemptively identify unfairness before elections. The opposition movement on their side of the house needs to say, we anticipate this election being unfair, and therefore we won't come out in the first place. But it is very easy for the ruling party to just flip that claim and say that they didn't come out because they were afraid to lose, or to say that there wasn't even going to be unfairness in the first place. So you don't actually get that political mobilization on their side of the house. The next thing we get is that there's going to be foreign attention to unfairness. What we pointed out, though, is that it is difficult to gain international support when there is no claim to democratic legitimacy. So on our side of the house, Juan Guaido contested elections in Venezuela, won the majority in the Legislative Assembly, then got silenced, and then Maduro's assets got frozen and the international community spoke out. So if anything, it is more likely on our side when there's a perceived democratic legitimacy to the participation of an opposition group in that election, which then sparks the international backlash that they thought was so effective. So if their mechanism was foreign attention, we got it better on our side of the house. The next thing they say is we can make the government look bad for unfair elections. But our claim was simple, that the government has easy ways to avoid these harms to legitimacy anyway. The fact they can allow fake opposition candidates to run, for example, in Russia, have them back down at the last minute, or if they gain power, making them Putin's pawns. They say real opposition still exists. Yes, but the point is that it's an easy way for the government to avoid all the legitimacy harms and still grant people a semblance of democracy, such they do not get upset and they do not protest on their side of the house. So you don't get any of the benefits of exposing a government for illegitimate purposes, especially because oftentimes the way in which they rig elections are subtle, for example, where you put the polling stations, etc. So they don't get any of the benefits of decreasing the legitimacy of the government. But contrast that to our side, where we said that we can get formal mechanisms like rallying and campaigning on our side. That these things are only granted to parties in times of elections. Yes, you can go to the town square on their side, but you can't get large-scale political mobilization because protests end up getting shut out. It is only in times of elections that avenues for spreading information are granted to the opposition to create that semblance of democracy. And that is why we only get the formal mechanisms for change on their side of the house, whereas they are locked out on theirs. We won on short-term politics. That was the most important theme. Even if we didn't, we better mobilize these movements in the long run and gain support. Very happy to oppose.
Chair recognizes a reply speaker of the opposition if the other judges are ready.
You can still hear me? Great. Side government's principal victory throughout the little which opposition parties held today. We heard a shifting case from the government. It started with an explicit characterization from first that this wasn't about North Korea. It wasn't about the most brutal dictatorships. It was about places in the middle. Places like Turkey, places like Hungary, places like Bolivia. By third, though, their only responses to all of our arguments were that, well, this will never work. You can never get any representation because these places are so brutal. If these places were so brutal proposition, then why does the opposition even exist in the first place? Running from the ballot box meant leaving democracy in the dust. I'm going to discuss two themes. First, structural change in aid, why that's most important. Secondly, support for the movement and into the future. We explained from the very start of this debate in first speech how you can get structural concessions from governments when you have at least some small amount of support in parliament. They only responded to a straw man of our case, which was one example of a potential constitutional reform. We pointed out how people like Juan Guaido was actually able to gain the majority in their legislature, and so it was possible. But even if it wasn't possible, we had other arguments about key concessions, like how in Turkey, after Ankara was taken, Erdogan had to concede raising taxes on the wealthy such that his population would not get angry. This meant that even if we didn't have our most maximal harms, we still get the minimal harms that make people's lives materially better on the ground. But in the future, regardless, when you entrench government support in regions that were once held by the opposition, you allow political patronage to seep in. You allow the granting of massive power plants like what happened in South Africa that destabilizes opposition support in specific regions. It means in the future, if they ever wanted to contest elections, they would not be able to get support. We heard no response to that argument from proposition as well. This meant that they could not get the structural change into the future that they gave no mechanism for other than amorphous protests that wouldn't work. Internationally, we said that it's harder to cover it up when after the last rigged election, you could have protesters and you could have international observers going in to make sure that the election would not be rigged. This is what happened in Kenya to great effect. Their only response was that's just one example. But the fact that it worked in one instance, the fact that you had international pressure on governments to step down, like what happened in Bolivia, meant that it can happen. Even if it's just small amounts, we can get that benefit. It meant that governments, when they delayed elections, as was pointed out in Max's speech, now had a justification for it because the opposition wasn't even coming to the negotiating table. They weren't even engaging in the election. That gave them the ability to destroy democracy into the future. Our argument from second speaker never received a response from government. So on structures, you're unable to access the ballot box. And this was important, as we explained from first, because it's not like democracy is only about protests, as they seem to think. It's about actually materially benefiting your lives, getting policies that benefit your taxes, getting policies that decrease the likelihood that you disappear in the middle of the night. On structural change, we won. Secondly, on support for the movement. We explained how you can see the perceptual harms of these policies on either side. So of course we can see people not going to the ballot box. But you can also see when people do go to the ballot box that if their political representation does not reflect the public opinion, like if they have 90% of the vote for the ruling party when realistically 90% were against it, you can still see that. You can still have that backlash. So that backlash was the same. But on our side, again from first speech, we explained how the legitimacy of your election now depended on the opposition being relatively free. It meant that you can have the political platform of being able to send out leaflets, the political platform of having a space on state-sanctioned television, of being able to hold town halls, of being able to hold protests. Whereas on their side of the house, government's legitimacy did not depend on the fact of this group existing, and so they could brutally crack down upon them. They could make their leaders disappear in the middle of the night. That debilitated the opposition. Their only push on this was that you're able to have protests instead, and that was an opportunity cost. But when you had more support on our side of the house, through getting broader reach through our political avenues, it meant that you could also have more protests in the future, as we also explained from first. But it was also a lot harder to get people to go to protest, risk their lives in the line of police officers than it was to go to the ballot. So even on support for the movement, we get better legitimacy and we get better ability to protest in the future. On both structural change and support, we win, we oppose.
Replies to proposition if both the other judges are ready.
Ready? Can I start?
Please begin.
Can I start? Okay. We find it quite ironic that the opposition in this debate is treating us as the government treats their opposition parties. They don't listen to us at all. They are strawmanning our arguments and using fancy words to appear greater than us. But let's go back a bit to an example from Serbia. In Serbia, we have a cult song that translates to "Go to Canada." It's not a happy and fun song about going abroad. It's a song about how corruption and a bad state of the country's economy and completely autocratic government is leading people to go to Canada, striving for a democratic, fair government that will treat them equally as everybody else. So let's see how opposition has brought a false characterization in this whole debate. First, they say and claim that these are the countries that have half-rigged elections and that just try to cover up their autocracy. But we say if that is the case, this song absolutely wouldn't exist in our world. But secondly, and most importantly, in second parts of their case, they use examples like Russia, which are complete dictatorships and absolutely don't give any reasons why, if we leave this as it is, Putin won't stay on his throne for the next 20 years. What we offer is a quick solution that maybe can make a change in the quickest possible way and the most effective way. So on both cases, we won that. But we believe that the opposition has a completely wrong characterization of the countries we are talking about. We are talking about, as I have said in my first speech, countries that are not completely dictatorships and that are not completely democratic. So we have brought a clear logic on how this will make a positive change for democracy inside the countries with international communities interfering and how the non-voters will react. But even if this doesn't work like we have explained, we still prove to you that as an opposition party to have a moral obligation to make fair election possible, because unfair elections are a mockery of democracy and people give money to opposition parties in vain. We have proved to you how this will absolutely make a change. Let's try to make a big deal now and get a solution to this problem, unlike the opposition which has brought a wrong characterization and absolutely no solution, and that will leave Putin to rule in corruption for the next 20 years. They had to prove why, in a corrupt and an undemocratic country, is it still better to go to the elections and not defend a wholly democratic country, or not to just blatantly attack Russia. They failed to prove their to see what their burden is, and then to prove why the election is still the best case scenario. So what we want to say, the only question left is why not both? Because why not the cause rights and go to the election? Because it doesn't make a change in a big way. It makes the opposition parties seem much more hypocritical. It doesn't get on the mainstream media, and it doesn't get the attention from foreign institutions, because elections still seem normal, and they are not. So what we wanted to say, you gave a completely wrong characterization, and also didn't prove why in a corrupt and undemocratic country it is still better to go to the elections. We need to do something because people demand change. Our realistic proposal gives the best chance of a democratic society. We want people to make a song that says, "Stay in Serbia, so let the motion pass."
Thank you, everyone. Well, the organizers for help so that the judges can be taken to a deliberation room. Until then, please don't communicate with each other on the chat just yet. Just wait for us.
Hi. You guys asked for help?
Yes, the debate has finished here. We'd like the judges to be moved to